Sounds good.
Here we go. Welcome, everyone. I see people starting to trickle in.
We'll wait for a few more seconds for folks to join. Welcome, everyone. I'm Anju Baraya. I'll be co-facilitating this session along with my colleagues, Jesse and Seraphe. Speaker for today's session is Mathias Eifert. He's a Lean Agile coach and delivery lead at Accela. He comes with wealth of information and is here with us to talk about Emergence, the past and the future of Agile. Few things regarding logistics. We will be using Q&A session for chat and taking questions. And Mathias would like to take questions towards the end of the sessions. So here you go, Mathias. Floor is all yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us in this session. And my name is Mathias Eifert. I am a coach and delivery lead at Accela. And if you're here in the Washington area, then you've probably heard of Accela, but if not, we are an agile technology company and a consulting company, and we're headquartered right here in Arlington, right outside of DC. We've actually been involved in the DMV Agile community for a very long time. And I ended up at Accela because, among many other meetups, they sponsor the DC Scrum User Group. And I mean, we have such a fantastic local community here in the DC area with so many awesome people. And so I'm really grateful to the organizers for putting all of this together today and for the last couple of days, and for inviting me to submit a proposal. That's, it's a great experience. And I've done a good number of conference presentations over the last 5 years, but this one is a bit unusual, and I really like the theme for A20 to be a bit more reflective. And so I embrace that as a challenge, I guess. So I'll be talking a little bit more from a personal perspective than I normally do, the things that influenced me along the way, that shaped my practice and thinking. And instead of trying to comprehensively cover every aspect of every topic that we touch on. And if you've seen any of my talks before, you might already have an idea that we'll probably cover quite a lot of ground. This time through that lens of emergence. So how did I get into Agile? Oh, sorry, now my slides aren't working. Still not working. That worked a moment ago, classic. Let's see if, okay, all right, so sorry about that. How did I get into Agile? And actually, this picture here is probably way too idyllic. I think I'd say my journey probably looks a lot more like this, really. So I got started in perhaps a somewhat unusual place. I studied cybernetics back in Germany, so I was exposed to feedback systems from the very beginning. I then spent some time in quality management with Six Sigma and control charts and such things. So I also got a taste of lean concepts that way. From there, I moved to software process improvement and CMMI. Yep, I'll never get those 3 years of my life back. And I was a trainer, I was a BA, I did some testing, some development, solution architect, a lot of different roles. And one fairly unexpected milestone along the way was actually this.
Sorry to interrupt, Matthias. Would you adjust your audio just a little bit?
Okay, do I need to up the volume?
No, it's just a little muffled.
Okay, me try it. Go to this. Is that any better?
That's much better.
Okay. All right. So yeah, one unexpected milestone along the way was actually this here. Somehow I landed on a project to rebuild the inmate management system for the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. Very unusual domain to work in. It was technically a legacy system replacement, but it was a pretty big jump. We went from mainframe green screen to a web-based decision support system. And it's actually still in use today, about 14 years later after we deployed the core system. It was planned initially as a waterfall project, but ended up turning out quite differently. When we started, there was one part of the system, the visiting module, that they needed way earlier than what the Big Bang timeline said, because they were literally working out of a shoebox with index cards. In their case, a catastrophic system failure would have been somebody dropping that box on the floor, right? And mind you, this is they have about 1,000 inmates at any given time, and it's probably one of the largest county jails on the East Coast. So they were really, really in the dark ages there. So we built them a visiting module as a standalone module in about half the time that they had expected. And that was cool, and everybody was happy. And so leadership agreed to build the rest of the system in increments as well. And then within each increment, we started with the basic happy path and then iteratively added more and more difficult features. And once the core system was deployed, we decided, hey, let's deliver a new update every month. And those releases would deliver whatever our users needed most from this list that they maintained. The developers would sit down with the analysts and the user representatives, and they would, figure out how much to take on for that next release. And at the end, the users would say, yep, it's good, or no, you got to change something about that. That should sound a little bit familiar, right? But it wasn't until a couple of years later that I went to a meetup and found that all of these patterns and practices that had worked so well for my team actually had a name. Jim York, who is presenting right now in the other breakout session, was the speaker for that meetup. And one thing he said really got me hooked. A good Scrum Master is always on the verge of being fired. I had never been fired and would have been absolutely mortified, but that sort of, rebel fantasy definitely sounded appealing to me. That and the fact that I realized my team in Fairfax had sort of invented a version of Scrum on our own because that's what worked for us. And now all of a sudden there was so much more to learn and explore and benefit from. It was great. I did eventually take my CSM and CSPO classes, but I honestly feel kind of lucky that I didn't start with Agile as a prefab package, right? I got to learn Agile organically through continuous improvement and experimentation with the team over the course of several years, and not really influenced by what others told us to do. And I think that really helped me in the long run. So I've been a consultant for my entire career. So I'm always working in new environments, new contexts with different drivers and constraints, what's possible, what's not, what is the change readiness. And almost always, we're pretty far away from the ideal. So I've needed to make trade-offs every single time. And to do that, I needed to come to an understanding of not just what are the patterns that work, but that's always context specific. But why do they work or not? And should I try this here? Can I even try it here? And if I can't, what's likely to happen? And can I mitigate that in other ways? And that's really served me quite well, especially at some point I started moving from software to working with data teams, and a lot of stuff works very differently there. And then interestingly, the same thing happened again. At some point, I found that there was something else that tied together a lot of what I had learned that supported my own sense making. And that was the Kinematic framework. And that caring about why, I found a lot of that explanation in the Cynefin framework. And to me, the ideas behind that have become essential to my Agile practice and how I coach and communicate both the opportunities and the constraints of Agile to others. I'm curious, I don't know if this feature is going to work, but how many of you are familiar with Cynefin? Can you just raise your hand in the app if you have any exposure to Cynefin previously? Can any of the moderators kind of see how many hands we're getting?
I see 6 hands, 5 hands,
All
7.
right.
So
Great.
a little bit, but not too much. Okay, well, let's do a quick walkthrough of the framework. And in case you're wondering about this particular picture, salt marshes play a prominent role in Kinevin, but that's kind of you'd have to do a bunch of reading a bunch of David Snowden stuff. So quick walkthrough of the framework. Kinevin was conceived as a sense-making framework by Dave Snowden in 1999, so it precedes the manifesto by a little bit. And it describes 4 different problem domains. The first one is a nice, stable corner of the universe where things are relatively simple. The name recently changed from obvious to clear, so I still have both of them there. You know, we once we define what we want to achieve, there's a clear best way of getting there, and we can do that same thing over and over again. Think making fries at your favorite fast food joint. This is the realm of best practices and standard operating procedures. Same inputs, same outputs. You could refer to this as a context of known knowns. We fully understand this. Sometimes there are several good options, and it requires some analysis and expert knowledge to really figure out what'll work and how that'll work. This is the complicated domain, the realm of good practices defined by experts. Most engineering and science problems fall into this category. Business rules, if we're talking software, certain design patterns. We have very clear cause and effect relationships, even though it may take us a while to figure them out, and there might be significant trade-offs that we're going to have to evaluate. But we do understand what parts of the solution are missing. So you could say there are known unknowns. We know what we're missing. And by the way, both of these domains describe what Snowden calls ordered systems. Often, though, we run into problems with a large number of inputs, some sort of open system where it's hard to define clear boundaries, and the way these inputs interact is not very well understood. We can only really see cause and effect after the fact, and even if we think we're doing everything exactly the same way for a second time or you know, the 100th time, things may turn out differently. This is what Kinevin calls the complex domain. Almost anything dependent on human behavior falls into this domain. Markets, consumer patterns, policy stuff, large projects, of course. And one issue here is that we can't fully grasp from the beginning what's going to be most important for our desired outcomes. And so often things will happen that we just did not anticipate. In the military, they use the term fog of war to describe this. We're dealing here with unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know we don't know, much less whether they're going to be important or not. And then the final domain here is called chaotic. We take all the messiness from complex, we make it even more random, and we often add significant urgency and potentially high stakes to it. So in other words, we have a dumpster fire. That dumpster may be very, very large, think healthcare.gov, for example, or it may only be relevant to, say, your next production release. That depends on your context. Chaotic, by the way, is not a permanent state. We either manage to stabilize things fairly quickly and move it to one of the other domains, or the dumpster will burn out and things crash. So there's actually a 5th domain here in the middle, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. And while these domains help us make sense of what we're dealing with, the reality is that very rarely do problems actually fall neatly into only one of these buckets, right? Even for a clear issue, we often have humans involved who might behave unpredictably. They tend to do that. Maybe because some instruction, some step in our SOP is ambiguous to them when it was very clear to everybody else. And on the flip side, even very obviously complex problems usually have elements that are pretty obvious and clear cut, or at least solvable with some good analysis. All right, we doing okay so far? I hope. So maybe the most important difference between the left side and the right is that on the right, we are working in a predictable environment. We have a reasonable expectation that we know what will happen if we do certain things. On the left, though, things are mostly unpredictable. And doing the same thing twice, as I already said, may actually have different outcomes. Mostly because there are inputs or relationships that we just don't have visibility into, or we just don't fully understand them. So this left side is a much more difficult space to work in. And yet, of course, that's where most of our problems are located these days. And in general, the complex domain is often a bit hard to embrace for people, at least initially, because maybe it's because after the fact we can usually establish some plausible cause and effect. We can look at it, it's like, oh yeah, because of this that happened, and then it's easy to think we just missed it when we first looked at it. Of course, these days, explaining complex, you just say COVID, and people are like, oh yeah, I got it. But often, there's a term called that I like to use to kind of explain the complex domain a little bit more, and it's called VUCA. It makes the complex domain a bit more relatable. So what does VUCA stand for? V is for volatility. How quickly do things change? The U is uncertainty. How much don't we know about this, and how aware are we of that? Often this comes down to how new is this thing, basically. Then we have complexity. Oh. In complexity, we often have so many aspects that can impact our outcomes, and we're just not sure how they interact with each other and which ones we need to pay most attention to. And then finally, ambiguity. People make assumptions about meaning all the time. And of course, we know that those assumptions are heavily influenced by our individual experiences and biases. And those are, of course, unique and different for every person. And then, of course, each one of these, right, amplifies the other ones. If we have more volatility, there's less time to clarify and flesh out ambiguity. More complexity means that more things we may not fully understand, and so we could have more uncertainty. So think about this for a moment. Who here thinks that VUCA has decreased in their life over the last decade? I can't see your hands, but usually it's not a lot of hands that go up, right? And of course, the term VUCA itself, of course, implies that all of these aspects are trending more and more towards the high end of the spectrum. And as we just discussed, they mutually reinforce and amplify each other. And one more thought, you can immediately see how scaling impacts pretty much every aspect of VUCA, right? Now, in some cases, the difference between complex and complicated is a matter of familiarity, of knowledge. If this problem is novel, then the rules often emerge over time as we figure it out, right? As we explore and learn. Uncertainty and ambiguity in particular can often be reduced that way. If we have high degrees of volatility or complexity, on the other hand, that may mean that any emerging rules don't even stay valid long enough to be useful in the long run. And then sometimes we can deliberately move things between domains if we can change the constraints of the system a little bit. To me, deployments are a great example of that, right? The research behind the DORA metrics positions the ability to do deployments well as an indicator of the overall delivery excellence. But as we know, traditionally and in many organizations to this day, deployments are a nightmare of complexity. There's always the possibility of unexpected outcomes. Often we get this close to dropping into chaos. And this complexity is, I think, mostly a lot driven by constraints, right? There are technical and cost constraints that result in non-standardized environments. This was a really big deal when we were still doing actual hardware. There's organizational constraints where different groups own different aspects and they're not aligned. Then there's what you could call capability constraints, where not everybody doing these deployments necessarily has the same level of relevant knowledge. But then things like DevOps and cloud and infrastructure as code and automated pipelines changed these constraints. And to a large degree, we ended up removing the human element, which is always complex. And once that's all in place, we end up with a system that has practically perfect repeatability, right? Push button deployments 1,000 times a day if needed. You check in the code, there's a single best way of deploying it, and we have moved this whole problem into the clear domain, which is amazing, makes things so much easier. Now, building all of that is not necessarily a trivial problem, but even that is actually getting more and more commoditized these days. So in many ways, you can look at infrastructure as code as a domain transition in Kinevin. But Kinevin doesn't just help us categorize problems, it also provides some guidance on how to approach each of these domains, right? The clear domain, the recommendation is sense, categorize, respond. In other words, you look at the problem, you determine which of your standard solutions applies, and then you execute that. Clear-cut rules make it pretty straightforward to automate stuff when that's helpful, like automated pipelines, for example. For complicated, that changes to sense, analyze, respond. It's basically a fancy way of saying examine the problem, analyze the solution options, maybe with a bit of back and forth, and eventually implement one of these options. For complex problems, though, just looking at it won't tell us much because unpredictability, right? So here the approach changes to probe, sense, respond. In other words, we have to do something, and it should be something small and safe. Then we observe what happens, good or bad, and we adjust and move forward from there. Essentially, we run experiments. The thing is, these experiments are not quite like our classic science experiments because there we actually require repeatability to accept the results. In the complex space, doing the same thing twice or what we think is the same thing will not actually necessarily give you the same outcome. So ideally, we actually want to try multiple things, maybe even at the same time, and then we build on that and amplify the ones that work. And in chaotic situations, finally, we don't have the time for gentle probing and we can't build on the outcomes anyway. There are no rules and the house is on fire. So here we need to act, sense, respond. We do the next thing that seems promising, see how that turns out, and then hopefully stabilize things, maybe after several tries. Now, does the approach for the complex domain sound familiar? Well, it obviously should, right? Probe, sense, and respond describes an iterative learning loop, an iterative adaptive learning loop, just like Scrum's inspect and adapt. In Scrum, essentially, each sprint output is a small probe. We get feedback, and then we adapt as necessary. And we have similar things in other Agile frameworks or related frameworks, right? Lean Startup has build, measure, learn. The military has the OODA loop. This goes all the way back to Deming's PDCA loop in the 1940s. And it was great to hear this morning in Alistair's keynote that one of the competing terms for Agile, got the same number of votes, was adaptive systems or adaptive approaches. So yeah, Agile is really a way to operate safely and as effectively as possible in the complex domain. And one thing that all of these iterative adaptive approaches are centered around is this idea of emergence. Things aren't visible in their complete form when we first look at them. Their attributes and behaviors need to be revealed gradually and hopefully deliberately. Now, not all emergent systems or not all emergence in a system stems from the system being truly complex, right? Sometimes what emerges is learning about how something unknown actually works. But from the outside, it kind of feels the same, at least initially. And this whole complexity is a spectrum anyway, right? Many things that were unexplainable 50 years ago, think genetics, for example, we now have pretty good rules for. And for those interested in that kind of stuff, this is also why and how most things on Wortley maps just keep moving to the right. And while I don't know this, of course, because I wasn't there, but I do think that the creators of the Agile Manifesto were attuned to the importance of emergence and how Waterfall essentially tries to suppress that, right? I mean, your classic requirement spec is completely non-emergent when we would really like it to be. But on the other hand, integration testing, if you do it all the way at the end, is usually way more emergent than we want it to be. All the things that Alistair was talking about this morning, contracts, plans, processes, tools, they're all designed to lock things into place. There is no room for emergence. You can also look at it through a VUCA lens, right? Waterfall ignores that volatility of both our user needs and the constraints under which we work. There's that initial uncertainty associated with new technologies and solutions, the complexity associated with systems of systems that we're building these days, and our inability to integrating these systems of systems just based on documentation alone is just not going to work. And of course, the ambiguity of documentation is really high compared to having just-in-time conversations between the relative people. But of course, the reality is that even 20 years in most organizations, emergence is still a constant battle, right? In so many ways. And personally, I think there's a significant connection to this fifth domain in Cynefin that we haven't talked about yet. It's here, oh, right. So you can tell the things on the left side are essentially favor emergence. The things on the right side are more fixed. And confusion, like the domain, the fifth domain in Kinevin is called confusion. It's in the middle, and it indicates the state of not knowing which problem context you're actually dealing with. Now, that may be because the decision maker just doesn't get it, or it could be that the decision has to be made by a group and people can't agree on what we're dealing with. And sometimes it's just not clear, right? Most problems don't fall neatly into just one domain anyway. So it could be hard to sort out. And we could even be looking at a paradox of sorts. Snowden lovingly refers to that as aporetic, not operatic, aporetic. He, like general accessibility of the Kinevin framework does not seem to be one of his primary concerns, unfortunately. But one thing about this, I've also made the experience that often we have confusion because the decision makers don't actually seem to be sufficiently aware of the differences between these domains and how they behave. But why is confusion important? Why is it such a central, literally central place in the model, right? The sense-making process always starts there, so that's all good. But then if people don't actually explore this landscape to consider which kind of problem they need to engage with, they just tend to apply their default behavior, whatever they're most comfortable with. Some people think that more process solves everything. I did work in CMMI, right? So they want to create detailed prescriptive procedures, no matter what. I'm sure you know somebody like that. People with expert knowledge often default to assuming that extensive analysis will always get you the best result, and sometimes they get stuck in what we like to call analysis paralysis. And then there's the sort of freewheeling types that improvise everything and don't like to be nailed down because, hey, things are going to change anyway. And of course, there's the firefighting heroes who may actually be drawn to a state of permanent crisis because that's where they get props and status for saving the day over and over. So confusion about what we're dealing with often creates this very serious mismatch between the problem and the solution approach that's being applied. And that usually does not end particularly well. And to me, the biggest clash that this usually sets up stems from a desire for predictability, wanting to operate on the right side of the model, right, in this ordered context. There's this big discomfort with not knowing. And predictability matters quite a bit, actually. You can see that in the way that we approach our work in traditional plan-driven solutions or approaches. We take a problem, this nice amorphous blob here on the left, and then we design the entire solution up front. And once we have that, we decompose that solution into small pieces of work, a work breakdown structure. Now that assumes what? Predictability, right? This entire approach is based on a massive assumption that we can predict everything that will need to be done. That in Kinevin terms, this is in the overwhelming majority at most a complicated problem. But of course, if it turns out that our problem, or maybe the best implementation path to get there, is different from what we expected, as we all know, this becomes very brittle very quickly. So yeah, it is true that most problems or systems are not purely complex, that there are elements of multiple domains. We have some simple things, some complicated elements, and a good number of complex aspects, this nice orange blob there. The problem is with this approach, we basically sprinkle the complex, less predictable stuff across everything we do. And because we usually do this kind of work in specialized silos for efficiency's sake, we have now boosted uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity because of all the dependencies that we've created. And the people doing the work have almost no context or ability to adapt. So we've actually increased VUCA overall and made things worse, potentially a lot worse. But still, this approach has an innate appeal, right? It lets us feel and also tell others that we're in control. And there's a lot of incentives around that. So it can be really hard to move away from the underlying assumption of predictability. And by the way, I've seen, quote, agile versions of this approach. You just replace the WBS with user stories and voila, you're done. I once worked with a client that had 3 years worth of user stories ready in their backlog, already allocated to releases, 3 years. And of course, they were written by a separate business analyst group. They were just waiting for a contractor to execute on that. And the thing is, they were honestly dismayed when they realized that that was not actually agile, because they thought they were doing agile. So Liz Kyo, I think is her how you pronounce her last name, has an interesting suggestion on how to approach this. She asks her clients to look at the various elements of their solution and then rate them against the scale here. Basically, it's from, yep, everybody has done this before and knows how to do it, to, yeah, nobody has ever done this before. And then she asks them where they think the risks are. And of course, that's the 4s and 5s, right? Now, these are still just the known unknowns. So we're talking about a complicated problem. But all of a sudden, it's now in the team's best interest to prioritize the hard stuff. And that opens up the possibility to uncover some of the unknown unknowns earlier and maybe realize how well this assumption of predictability actually holds up or not. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a consultant, and telling clients that the team would like to focus for a good while on a bunch of POCs and prototypes so that we can learn, that's a hard sell usually. So to make that a bit more palatable, what I've started doing often is using what I call a hybrid approach, a blend of both customer value and information value. So we try to identify one or more fairly independent modules or increments, something that's a bit better understood, and preferably maybe even has some standalone business value, right? Like that visiting system I mentioned earlier. And then we deliver that to build trust with the client, and also, frankly, so that they can show their stakeholders that, yes, indeed, progress is being made. But in parallel, we also do these proof of concept things to explore the unknowns, the big risks there. And yes, that does split the focus of the team a bit, but it's usually a trade-off that's worth making. And actually, you only need a couple of people most of the time anyway. So that's been pretty successful. And actually, this does work really well with an agile approach to decomposition. Because one key difference to the approach I described earlier is that in agile, we decompose our problem into smaller problems, subproblems of the overall thing. And only once we have something that we think we can be solved within 2 weeks or so, we define solutions for that. And some of these subproblems will be complex, but others will only be complicated or even clear, right? Oh, yeah, we've done this part a whole bunch of times before. So the agile idea of decomposing in the problem space and solutioning only for small subproblems allows us to a much larger degree to isolate these domains from each other and take advantage of keeping the simple stuff simple and only making it harder when that's actually necessary. And then we can, for example, prioritize the hard stuff for learning and some simpler things to show progress. And then by integrating these solutions back into our overall system, we can close that larger feedback loop and actively learn about whether we actually understood our problem correctly or maybe need to adjust a bit. Now, how big these solution increments should be is pretty context dependent, right? We kind of tend to praise the shortest possible loops, aka sprint length. But I recently worked with a very high performing team that is actually doing great with 3-week sprints. They work on a data science product with very low volatility, and most of their work is kind of under the hood anyway and not visible to the end users. So the feedback they need comes mostly from within the team. They worry about things like what is the accuracy and predictive power of the latest iteration of our analytics model, or what's the data quality of this new source that we are including? Is our EDLT job running fast enough? And also, they work very explicitly towards outcomes, not just building widgets. And that's much harder to time box anyway. Now, when we talk about risk, we really talk about 3 main questions, right? Does it provide customer value to solve this problem? And that could be direct value or some sort of enabler. And if so, can we solve it given the capability we have? And if that is true, can we solve it in a sustainable way while staying within our relevant constraints around cost and time and revenue streams, legal, whatever? And it's not a coincidence that these questions map perfectly to what assumption mapping categorizes as desirability, feasibility, and viability. And I really, really like that tie-in with assumptions, because in complex problems with unknown unknowns, we can't ever know all the important risks to mitigate. We can't make a perfect list of like, here's all the things we need to pay attention to. So instead, I've started flipping the usual approach to risk management around into what I call now riskiest assumption thinking. Instead of relying on identifying specific risks, we look at where would any unexpected negative outcomes have the biggest impact, and then we can focus mitigation on that. What is most important to actually work as we expected it in order for this effort to be successful? Again, more of an outcome focus. And assumption mapping is a great tool for that. So risk is a really big deal, all right? In general, when I talk to decision makers about why Agile, this here might just be my most important slide. You've all seen this, of course, right? And the key point is that with plan-driven approaches, you carry the entire cost of the project as risk all the way until the end. And you throw in some stories like that $400 million FBI case file system that was never turned on because it was just no good, or the $1 billion that the VA spent on, I think, 2 failed attempts to build an electronic health record system. Neither one of them were ever delivered. And then you ask these decision makers whether they've ever experienced a project that was canceled or never used. Of course, after burning through a lot of time and money. I just talked to a potential client. They went through 50 millions worth of that, right? Just in one project. And the thing is, most senior people have seen something like that. And so you're setting the ground, and from there you can now talk about how predictability is really not a given. And without that, it's very risky on trying to make things fail-safe with detailed plans and all of that. Instead, you have to make it safe to fail. And once that risk part starts sticking, the good thing is there's also an upside that we can pull out. That letting go of the insistence on predictability is actually a prerequisite for innovation, and everybody wants innovation. But it's surprisingly difficult to come up with new, drastically different, better ways of doing things if it's required that every aspect of this be understood up front. Innovation is usually emergent, right? Snowden actually talks about what he calls the shallow dive into chaos to encourage innovation. You temporarily loosen a lot of the rules and constraints to see what people come up with, what emerges, and then you pull back to evaluate. And then, of course, there's the contrast slide, how Agile is here to save the day for them if they let us do it right. There's only one small problem with that, and that is that Agile is actually maddeningly vague about value. This here is the only mention in the manifesto. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Continuous delivery of valuable software. Have more beautiful words ever been spoken? The clouds part, the heavenly trumpets sound, and there it is, sparkling with the promise of user delight. Oh, if only we could assume that all software that a team might deliver is valuable and makes the customer happy, right? Has anybody here ever worked with a team that did a great job producing software, but perhaps that software didn't make the customers perfectly happy? Jason Hall had a whole presentation about this yesterday. So yeah, if only predicting what valuable software is were that easy. So perhaps the biggest thing about the manifesto that is in need of updating is this assumed equation of working software with value. And this kind of ties back to the fact that in some ways, Agile is pretty limited in scope, right? It starts with requirements per the manifesto, these days almost always in the form of a backlog. And it ends with working software. And yes, I'm aware that Scrum does not equal Agile, but the visual nicely illustrates the point. Backlog in the front, working software in the end. Now, DevOps has definitely expanded the scope on the output side. Now we have some more guidance on what to actually do with this precious software after we've developed it. But on the front end, there's still a significant gap. In the beginning, there was the backlog. There are some very good ideas in product management about what comes before the backlog, but there's also a lot of tension. Unfortunately, I found that many people in the product management community don't actually seem to be particularly fond of Agile. This quote here by someone in the product community addresses this scope limitation, right? Agile doesn't have a brain. It just executes on whatever you feed it. The focus is on building the thing right, not fundamentally about whether we're building the right thing. And yet, value is the single riskiest assumption because making the wrong predictions there destroys your ROI. So why would you be doing this in the first place? So in my Agile practice, I increasingly focus on that front end, right? How much uncertainty is there? How open-ended is this? Have we even defined what success would look like? beyond having produced all the requested widgets, because that's kind of what we work to usually. What outcomes are driving this? So as a coach or even as a delivery lead, the first person I'm concerned with these days is the product owner. Are they up to this? And so I try to work with them on getting some type of exploration going, some version of lean discovery. And if we can, is it possible to get cheaper, faster feedback on value to explore that before we ever build any software at all? Lean Startup has a lot of good ideas there around exploring value. And if we have to actually build something, can we develop, some sort of a value hypothesis, HDD, and explore how to solve for that, and then run it through our beautiful pipelines to get that customer feedback and close the value loop. And yes, I do realize that that last sentence inappropriately reduces DevOps to just pipelines, and there's a lot more to it, but you get the idea. And you could actually argue that there is an aspect of a machine to that tail end. Gene Kim of Unicorn Project has a beautiful slide where he makes the case that it's exploration and complex until you check in the code. And from there on, you want as little variance as possible. You need that predictability to close that bigger feedback loop about value, and you want to close that quickly and with low risk. And which is why that infrastructure as code domain transition that I talked about earlier is so important. But of course, if we have high uncertainty around whether this thing we're building is actually the right thing, then the question is, how much of that stuff on the right do we even need? In Kanban terms, most of this is muda type 1, right? Necessary waste. But if it's potentially throwaway, is that waste really necessary? I mean, even Kent Beck is on record now for saying that TDD during exploration is kind of overkill. So one of the things we started looking into at Excella is multi-level definitions of done, especially for our data teams. There's a lot of exploration going on in data, and building all that infrastructure to implement these things on the tail end is not nearly as commoditized in the data space as it is in, say, web development. And so these teams sometimes initially cut some corners, mindfully and in a consistent way, hopefully, and then they gradually tighten the definition of done. Because early on, the speed of feedback is really most important. And one other example, I recently worked on a team where we had a lot of these big technical risks. And so as part of that hybrid approach that I mentioned earlier, the team was doing normal 2-week sprints, building stuff. But in parallel, I worked with one of the developers on a proof of concept in what was essentially 1-day sprints. We did put a 2-week spike into Jira because you got to do what you got to do. But then we just met every day to review and adjust, and we had zero concern about the definition of done. It was honestly one of the most productive things I've done in my life, I think. So yeah, to start wrapping things up, complexity and the resulting unpredictability are, for me, really the primary why for Agile. Now, don't get me wrong, Agile promotes a lot of other great things too, especially around people and the way we work, and those are really important. But in my view, you can respect your people and empower them and work at a sustainable pace independent of Agile. And I mean, there's honestly plenty of Agile out there that still struggles a lot with unrealistic demands and suboptimal leadership. So building on that why here, to me then, the main benefit of Agile is that it allows us to better manage emergence, of innovation on the upside, of risk on the down. So with executives, I talk about Agile mainly as risk management these days. And yes, happier people if they do seem to care about that. But the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities are connected to value, not implementation. And traditional Agile wasn't explicitly focused on that. As Alistair said, they just wanted to finally get to working software. But I feel like today as Agilists, we should really rally around our product owners, and we should try to learn as much as we can from Lean Startup, UX, and product management. Because to me, the future of Agile, as awesome as it may be, is not going to be as an island. All right, and that is the end. I think we have a few minutes left for Q&A. I'm also going to post a Zoom link in the chat in case somebody wants to continue the conversation over lunch, but what do we have in terms of questions?
So thank you, Mathias, for a great session. We do have 3 questions, but I don't think we have time to take on right now. So
okay.
That would be great if you can post the Zoom link, and you can go and answer the questions on Whova through Q&A session chat.
Sounds good. Yeah, I apologize. I talked a little slower than I anticipated, but
It was great presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed that. And thank you
yes.
so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. And I hope this did have maybe some interesting ideas, or at least there was some 2% truth in there that you can explore and figure out how much of that is going to work for you.
So do you want to give the link to the Zoom?
Yeah, I need to get out of the presentation, so I'm going to stop sharing and then post that there and switch to that Zoom meeting. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Maybe see you on the other side.
Thank you, Matthias.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.